to risk. And so the goal with rate setting is to match payment to risk. And this includes setting rates that are neither inadequate nor excessive. And it also entails setting rates for a future period, not previous period, otherwise known as prospective rate setting, or they're prospective in nature. One component to note is that through this process, at times this could result in an increase, other times in a decrease, depending upon the circumstances within a given program. Some of the ramifications are that providers should be paid more for costly or complex programs, and rates should encourage efficiency in production. The approach to the rate setting process here first included gathering available data sources. And the general calculation is similar to what DHCS is using, and that looks at coming up with an hourly rate. So to do a brief walkthrough of this formula, this includes starting first with hourly wages, and that's going to be a historical amount, a regional factor, an increase to account for benefits, also an increase to account for leadership and support costs, and then a further increase to account for indirect and operating expenses. Because the hourly wages that are being looked at initially are historical nature, then this needs to be trended forward to the contract period that's in question. And then once this is all calculated, then this is divided by the productivity assumption, which reflects the fact that not all hours available for staff members are actually hours that can be billed to Medi-Cal. So that's what's behind the scenes within the hourly rate. You'll see this formula again, and then we'll talk through the assumptions that went through each of these later throughout the presentation here. The rates have been varied by program and provider type to match payment to risk. And we looked at estimated impacts for individual providers. And through this process, we've refined assumptions as needed as we've looked at various data sources and had various discussions with the county. So the next few slides are going to look at the various data sources that we received. You'll see a very similar setup in terms of how the slides are laid out. We'll talk about some of the insights that were available through each data source. We'll look at some of the limitations, and to the extent there are problems with certain data sources, we'll highlight that as well. So the first data source that we looked at and we're showing here is the Smart Care data. So this provides insight with granular emerging experience, and it's by program and provider type and also by date. It allows us to be able to look at and study the changing care consumption within the program. And it also allows us to look at place of service data, which can be used to estimate productivity as we look at higher concentrations of field versus non-field work. Some of the limitations of the Smart Care claims data is that it requires supplemental information to be able to determine productivity, since claims are the focus of this data set. And because of the nature of claims and the fact that they take some time to get paid, there is a little bit of a delay on some of the more recent emerging experience. The next data source is the FTE surveys. So some of the insights here, and the main one is that it pairs with Smart Care data to be able to produce a productivity estimate. We can look at the actual units that are being billed within the Smart Care data. We can pair that with the information in the FTE surveys and link those up to come up with the productivity estimate. Limitations include that we can't validate the data, but we have checked for reasonableness with other sources. The data were available for a 6-month period, so changes in staff within that period isn't visible to us. It's more of a snapshot. And we received about half the templates back, so there are some holes in our understanding within this data. Some of the data was clearly wrong within the data that we received here. So that is something that we've omitted within here. Note that and a contextual component here, what we saw in terms of data being wrong is when there were implied productivity amounts above 100%. So in those cases, we removed those data points from the analyses. The next data source is a step ones. This provides providers' expectations for wages, benefits, leadership and support, and indirect and operating expenses. Those are some of the key components of the rates that we walked through a few slides ago. Limitations are that it appeared that some providers tied back to more of a total contract amount rather than populating best estimates. And the productivity that was included in a lot of these was unrealistically high. Next, we have the cost reimbursement analysis, and this provides total fee-for-service based revenue as well as total expenditures. It allows us to be able to have an emerging view of gain and loss under the fee-for-service model. Some limitations are that the cost reimbursement analysis, or CRA, was provided at the program level, not individual provider type, and it wasn't provided by all programs. No, even though it wasn't provided by all programs, what we saw is that of the smart care utilization, roughly 90% of that utilization in the smart care data was covered or being provided via a program that did provide a CRA. So we have a lot of good information, just not 100% information with the CRAs. Another data source is the DHCS rate setting process. So some of the insights gathered here is that the BLS data that was used is a credible source of wages, and it's calibrated to Sacramento County. The CMS inflation sources that were used are credible for trending data up to state fiscal year 25. And it also uses a survey of counties on leadership and support and indirect and operating costs. The limitation here is that productivity was not differentiated by a program or provider type. Another data source is Cal Mesa productivity estimates. This information allowed us to be able to look at productivity differentials by provider type. Limitation is that there's not variation by program within the source. And overall, the productivity is higher than realistic within the first year. So that takes us through the data sources we looked at. In the next few slides, we'll talk through how some of those sources were used and how they tie into the hourly rate calculation. So looking at the assumptions here, you'll see a repeat of the formula from a few slides back, looking at how the hourly rate is calculated. So we'll step through each of these. The first component is the wages, and the data source being used here is the BLS data. So we use the BLS wages by provider type, and they were calibrated to the cost of labor within Sacramento County. And as a way to validate the sources, we looked at the wages in step ones, and they were similar, but generally modestly lower than the BLS data. So overall, the BLS data did come out slightly higher than what the step one wages implied. The next component is the benefits. So these data sources, here we looked at the step one reported benefits and also the contracted providers. And we use the reported benefits and gross them up for contracted workers. This gets to the understanding that in some cases, information provided was for contracted providers, and there might not have been a separate amount broken out for benefits because those might be baked into those contracts that are in place. And overall, the benefit percentage roughly aligned with data that we've seen outside of Sacramento. So that was a validation view that we had within the benefit load. The next couple rate components came from the step one. So the first is leadership and support. So we aggregated the step one data and saw what this implied on a fixed percentage load amount. And this was applied consistently to all the providers and program types. And this follows a similar process to the DHCS rate setting. Likewise, with indirect and operating expenses, step one data source was used. This was applied instead of on a percentage load that is consistent across all providers and programs. It was applied at an FTE level. So it's more of a consistent amount that's built in for each staff type. And this also is generally similar to what DHCS has within their rate setting process. So next is trend. So this is where we've gone through the first four adjustments that establishes essentially a historical baseline of wages, gross step for benefits, leadership and support, and indirect and operating expenses. Now trend gets us to project that historical time frame into the fiscal year 25 time frame. And this is based on the CMS Home Health market basket trend and is applied from fiscal 21 to fiscal 25. And is consistent with what DHCS used as well. So the last assumption is the productivity assumption. And this is one of the major assumptions here. And we'll talk more in depth on this in a couple slides, but to start with the data sources that we looked at, first is the smart care data, where we can look at place of service and also utilization. And we looked at the FTE surveys and also the CalMesa productivity. So the general process for this is that by looking at what was contained in the FTE surveys and then looking at the utilization within the smart care data, that allowed us to get to an overall estimate of productivity across all programs and provider types. Then it became looking at various data sources and understanding different dynamics within the program to look at things on a provider type basis and also by program. And in most instances, we were able to look at this on a data-driven basis. In some cases, we've relied on similar program reference points, particularly in cases where the results maybe were unintuitive based on what the data showed or were for programs or providers that had lower volume. So starting with an overall productivity amount, breaking that out into provider type and program differences, we then multiply the factors together to get to an amount that is specific to the program and provider type level. And the variety of data sources that were used here were used to validate the results. And this also included several discussions with Sacramento County to ensure that the productivity relativities that we arrived at were logical and made sense for the various programs. So this next slide gets into a little bit of a different discussion around the assumptions. You'll see the same rate components coming down on the left, but we'll speak to where there was or wasn't variation at the provider type or program type. Know that we intentionally stayed away from any agency-specific adjustments. So the variation will just be at a combination of provider type, program type, or no variation in some cases. The wages that were used are by provider type, and those need to vary to reflect the costs of different workers. The theory is that wages may need to be higher in more intensive programs. However, the step one data didn't quite bear that out consistently, and there was not significant patterns there. So this is why we've looked at them consistently at the provider type level. The benefit load does not vary at provider type or program level. This is built in as a percentage that's consistent across all types. And generally, these were pretty consistent and within the same ballpark at the program level. And we didn't have specific visibility on benefits by provider type. The leadership and support adjustment also is consistent across provider type and program. There was not any discernible or cohesive patterns that we observed within the review of the data. The indirect and operating adjustment does vary by provider type. And this is more of a fact that there's the effective variation, because this was built in specifically on an FTE level. That means there's a consistent amount that's built in for each provider type, which therefore is going to mean that providers with higher wages will have a lower effective percentage. Providers with lower wages will have a higher effective percentage based on the constant amount built in. Trend does also not vary. It's consistent across all, and we didn't have data points suggesting any differentiation there. So that is consistent across provider and program type. And productivity is varied both at the provider and the program level. So when we looked at the Smart Care and FTE survey data and also CalMesa's estimates, they supported the need to vary it by the provider type level. And at the program level, differences were seen within the Smart Care data, and differences were seen in the place of service data as well. So varying the productivity by program also seemed appropriate. So the next slide, we're going to spend a little bit more time on the productivity assumption, since again, that is one of the key adjustments within the process. So to start with, the overall productivity was set at 29.5%. And this is the starting point where before we've allocated by provider and program type, that's the overall target that we get back to. This does exceed the average of what we saw in fiscal year 25. So we're showing the quarterly amounts here for the emerging fiscal year 24 data. Quarter one's productivity amount in total was about 24%. It increased to 27% in quarter two, and then increased to 30% in quarter three. So we do see that it appears to be trending up within the fiscal year as we look quarter over quarter, month over month. But some of this also could be driven by seasonality. So that could be a component of this. Note that quarter three is likely a little bit understated due to completion, since we're using the Smart Care claims data to come up with the utilization amount that drives this percentage. Those claims are not fully complete yet. We'd expect there to be higher utilization once that time period was complete. And then that could mean that the current assumption or current observation of 30% is higher than what it would be once that claim data was complete. Another note on the 29.5% that we're using here, this is based on a total hour amount of 2,080. So that's what this productivity percentage is relative to in terms of implied hours across the entire year. So as time goes on, we do expect that continued adaptation to fee-for-service and to Smart Care make it reasonable to assume that there will be a modest upward trajectory on productivity over time. But this is kind of the current historical snapshot and emerging data that we're looking at on this point. So productivity was varied up and down, and this is essentially varying off of that 29.5% overall target, up or down, depending on the circumstance. So the provider type level, we used a combination of productivity that was measured directly from the Smart Care and FTE templates, and then also CalMesa relativities. So we noted on one of the prior slides that we think the current overall productivity implied with CalMesa is high for the first year, but the relativities between provider type we can use to inform decisions on how to allocate the productivity of 29.5% differently at various provider type levels. So those are the data sources that were looked at to vary the provider type level. And at the program type level, a combination of productivity from the Smart Care and FTE templates was used. And we also looked at the place of service. So the idea is that if we have programs that have a higher concentration of field work compared to office work, it's more likely, all else being equal, that that provider type or that program will be less productive because there's more travel time, there's a little bit less face time because of the nature of the field work. So we assume that field work would be about 62.5% as productive as office work, and this is a mechanism to recognize the differences in productivity between field versus office work. So with that, we'll talk briefly about the results of the rate changes based on the buildup that we discussed here. So the impact of the fiscal 25 rates will depend on your mix of programs and provider types. Using actual utilization from July through December 2023, the overall rates on average are increasing by around 17%. Note that this doesn't include the impact of any of the add-ons. Those codes are shown here. And then on the next slide, we'll have the composite impact at the program type level.
I'm sorry, Barry, before you go on, could you go back 2 slides really quick? Could you talk about that 62.5% and how it relates to the 30%? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, so this is a different mechanism to reflect the fact that the data shows the 29.5% is an overall reasonable level. But the 62.5% is just looking at relative expected differences between field work versus office work. So the way that this plays out is that the programs that have a higher concentration of field work would therefore have a lower productivity amount than that 29.5%, all else being equal. And the ones with higher office work would have a higher productivity amount built into here than the 29.5%. So it basically shifts that 29.5% down or up depending on concentration of field versus office work.
Yeah, and Barry, let me just add on with an example which could help clarify it. So, and these aren't these numbers are just hypothetical to illustrate it. So, if you could be 40% productive in the office, it's saying that you could then be 25% productive in the field. So 25 is 62.5% of 40. So it's an estimate of the difference to try to give more to try to hold the field work to a lower standard. But it in itself, the 62.5% is not a measure of productivity. It's just a way of differentiating those two levels. So I hope that helps clarify it.
Thank you.
All right. So switching gears to the composite change by program, and note these rate changes are aggregated for informational purposes. So it's behind the scenes, it's based on the smart care utilization across all Sacramento County providers. So it will vary at the provider and program level based on actual mix. But in aggregate, this is the approximate 17% we talked about on the prior slide. And we can see where some of the concentration of changes exist in various programs. So after this call, there will be additional information provided with rates. One of the items that will be provided, and I'm going to switch gears to an Excel file here, is a provider rate comparison tool. So to briefly walk through how this works and how providers can use this information, what's shown here is program and provider type, and you'll see the current rate and the proposed rate and the rate increase. So what can be input here is the expected total available hours. So for example, if there's a total available hours of 2,000, there's inherent productivity. It's currently set at 30%, but providers, programs can input this based on productivity expectations that you might have specific to your business. But in this case, it results in 600 billable Medi-Cal hours. We'll have another one here just so we can see how things work here. So then you can fill this out as applicable. Then down at the bottom, it'll have an aggregated amount specific to what's been input here. And that'll have a provider and program specific mix. So in this case, the mix of providers in the first program based on the input utilization results in about a 13.6% expected increase. So that's the way the tool works, and will help give information in terms of expectations for your specific program and providers.
And just one thing to add, in column E there, that's where that 30% is kind of applied. We just for simplicity, we applied that to all provider types, but definitely you should feel free to overwrite both columns D and E to meet your expectations on, how providers would bill a different amount of their time. Just like in the rates, we reflect, certain provider types like psychiatrists have more, a higher productivity expectation. You probably want to fill that in as you would expect it to occur.
All right. So with that, we'll open it up to questions.
I could just, before we jump into lots of questions, but the questions are definitely welcome. Please ask while we have opportunity here with Optumas. Just want to say a few other things. I do think that these were relatively, we can't set the rates too high and we don't want to set the rates too low. I think this was hopefully the sweet spot. Again, 17% going up is quite a bit, and I have to be able to justify it to county leadership, but this has ultimately been calculated by a third-party independent agency that doesn't have any skin in the game. They completely developed these based on what was all the different factors that they already pointed out. I do want to represent that this is a shared sort of this particular funding mechanism. It does introduce shared risk. We can't set productivity so low that that we are completely not that anybody has asked us to, but completely subsidizing the program. And we also need to keep in mind that we do still anticipate that DHCS is going to, in the future, be making the county move to a capitation rate. And the way they're going to do that is based on our actual data. And so we have to have our productivity at a manageable level. So that when we go to capitation, Sacramento County is not one of the losers. And I do anticipate when we move to capitation, there will be counties that win and will be counties that lose as a result of that because of what their prior history of billing was. So we really, as a system, it's all in our best interest to, I know we don't want to set productivity too high, but it's also in our shared best interest to make sure we don't set productivity too low either, in order to continue to, set up our system in a way that we're going to be able to ultimately be able to benefit from capitation. I do think, looking at some of the data where some of the programs are starting to be able to make the current rates almost work, and in some cases work, I do think that there's probably some opportunity where you could, with just a little bit of an increase in productivity, be able to significantly bring in some good amounts of revenue, to the point where I think that there are opportunities where you're going to have more revenue than your costs. And that is ultimately what our goal is. I want to just reiterate too on that topic that My hopes are that if you are beginning to see more revenue, that, you know, we're going to take into consideration for future years, future year negotiations around rate increases. And it really is, I think, an opportunity for providers to begin looking at developing wages that are more competitive with some of our competing employers. And so our hope and expectation would be that as you do start seeing more revenue than what your current costs are, that those additional revenues could be used to bolster your service providers' wages. And so what I'm trying to emphasize is we don't want to, and I'm not saying that any of you would do this, but just to put it on the table, we're not wanting to see a lot of increases in our administrative costs. We are wanting this to be an opportunity for us to begin increasing salaries in a way that it is more competitive for our direct service providing programs. I recognize there's all sorts of other dynamics going on right now. We have potential SB 525. We have all these other things going on as well, but really want to emphasize that our hopes are that going forward, we're going to be able to continue to improve as it relates to the salaries for our direct service providing staff. The 30%, 29.5, 30% productivity is an adjustment down from where the feds were putting it at 40%. So wanting to recognize that there was a significant adjustment that's been made. And then I'll stop there and see what sort of questions you all have.
I had a question for the rates. It's at 17%. Does that mean current rates is going to be increased by 17%, or is it going to be by program or by a provider type? Just want to clarify what that meant.
Yeah, so that's the aggregate average. That's where the tool that that will be coming will help provide some clarity into specifics at the provider and program level. So yeah, that 17% is a composite. Some cases there are some reductions, other cases larger increases, or smaller increases. So that's an overall composite amount.
And Barry, it's a 17% increase over what their existing rates were.
Correct, over the current fiscal year 24 rates. That's correct.
On average. So you can see that some programs were higher than that 17% and some were lower. I see Lakshmi has a question.
Yes. My question is, I am struggling how to tell my staff about productivity. When they are driving, it doesn't mean they are not being productive. They're not sleeping behind the wheel. Or when they are documenting, it's the same thing. And as an adult FSP, we do so much of the community-based work. And if our rates are not reflective of what they are doing, whereas all the other things like travel time and non-billables and documentation time is not taken into consideration, they are really demoralized. Right now, our staff are really struggling because we keep saying documentation, travel, non-billables are all non-productive. And that's where I'm not able to reconcile with them.
Yeah. Let me jump in to answer this one. So I just want to be clear that when we use the word productivity, we are not using it as a judgment that people are sleeping or being lazy or anything like that. We're using it as a term to differentiate in a binary fashion whether something is Medi-Cal billable or not Medi-Cal billable. And we have recognized that the travel and the documentation time in FSP is what we did see in the data, that FSP has higher travel, and we reduced the productivity expectation accordingly. And as you can see, those are some of the higher rate changes in the slide that Barry has. So we are absolutely taking it into account. It's not falling between the cracks or anything. We will call it just in the context of this meeting, non-productive time, but that doesn't mean that we're judging it in a negative light.
A better way to call it is reimbursable productivity and non-reimbursable productivity. That then captures the essence. This is reimbursable, the direct face-to-face services, whereas all that other productivity like documentation and non-billable and travel are non-reimbursable by Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're open to changing the language on it if that's causing concern.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, we have Optumas with us.
Ryan, there's quite a few in the chat.
Okay, is there one you'd like to start with?
I noticed that like AOD counselors aren't identified. Is that something separate, or were they not included in this review? Some of the other substance use prevention treatment positions also.
They're included under the SUD program.
Okay, all in one.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Ryan, I asked, it's probably a county question, not an Optumas question, but what is the process for county leadership to approve both process and timeline, these adjustments?
Right, so we are obviously behind the 8 ball as it relates to contract development. So we're pretty much trying to run with these rates. And so going to send out the tool for you all to see how things settle out for your different programs. That tool is going to be very helpful. You only fill out the cells that are relevant to your program, and you'll be able to get a feel for how you're going to come out in it. And I really do think that we should see some really great results from that when you do your own personal individual work. Getting an international call, which was not for me. Sorry about that.
Will there be a need, or is there a desire for providers and or our association to advocate at leadership level around this? Is it going to? No. Okay.
I don't think so. I think we're working on it.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in and say, this is April from Hope Cooperative. I just want to say thank you so much for the time and effort that went into this. I think that this was some of the due diligence and some of the work that we've been asking for, and for the county to really give green light to bring another third-party provider in to take a look at this is so important. I think it's imperative that these numbers really, I know that the hope that we all had is that the information could be really reviewed and streamlined and looked at in a way that gave voice to some of the concerns that we were seeing. So to really honor that is so appreciative. Thank you so much to the county for looking at that, and then for Optumas coming in and pulling this together as well has been really incredible. So thank you so much.
And I just want to piggyback on April. I really appreciate the very thorough walkthrough and the transparency. I think that is incredibly helpful. Granted, on a Monday morning, I probably understood about 50% of it, but hopefully it was the important 50%. But I really do appreciate it, and just know that we, and I'm sure the other providers also, are really cognizant of the importance around that productivity. We want Sacramento County to be in a good position when capitation comes down the line, because we know that if it's good for you, that it's going to be good for us as well. And just appreciate the bringing in Optumas and doing this thorough of an evaluation. And I'll just put a pitch out there, and this is so, this is very, well, this is in my own benefit, that as we're bringing on solutions to really help that productivity and increase that productivity, we hope you stand with us and support us in that. Thanks.
David?
Yeah, thanks for taking a deep dive on these rates. I do have a question about contracts. So I know we've already received a lot of contracts, and so are there going to be adjustments then? And what I mean by that is, so if we take the amount of our contract and we raise the rates, which is wonderful, it'll help us pay our staff more competitively at historically low rates for our staff compared to, other systems in Sacramento. But that'll drive down, unless I'm not thinking about this correctly, that will drive down the number of services that we end up providing, which would, there's folks out there that need the service. So would we expect that if you take these new numbers and put them in our productivity, you need a higher amount on the contract? Am I not right on that?
The part about if you're exceeding your contract?
No, I'm saying, so if
max contract amount?
Yeah, I think this will push us. If we do the same amount of work, this is going to push us past our contract amount. So we're going to see some contract adjustments coming before the end of the year, or?
It won't be before July 1st.
Okay.
If we see
Just adjust later, that's fine. That makes sense.
Contracts using up their available funds, then we will need to go back and make adjustments at that point.
Okay. I'm just saying these are increases. So if we just do the same amount of work we're doing, it'll push us over the total, obviously.
Well, yeah, I hope so. But you remember that a lot of this was based on what current behaviors are occurring in smart care. So
okay.
We'll see. I hope so.
And then I just have one other question, and it's really on the STRTP rate with a 3%. It's the most intense work that we have on this system, in my view. And I realize it was a little bit higher than some of the others, but I wouldn't mind. I guess when I see that full tool, I'll see a better breakdown on how that was calculated for the STRTPs. I'm a little concerned about making sure that there's enough available beds for kids in Sacramento, and it's really tough to hire folks for that program already. So.
Yeah, the tool will have specifics on provider types within each program, and hopefully we'll shed a little bit of insight on where that breaks out.
I was scanning through chat. I think we caught the questions in chat. Were there any other questions? All right. Well, we will, as indicated in the in chat, the slides will be sent out, the tools will be sent out. Really appreciate everybody's time. I want to extend my gratitude to Jim and his team for the technical assistance you've been providing over these last few weeks. They're greatly appreciated. And I think we're in a good place moving forward. We're all learning together, as we've been saying along the way here. want to make sure before we close, just to give a final shout out to see if there's any additional questions that might have come up.
Kelly, just can you tell me when the tool will, I know it's going to be shared. Do we have a time when it'll be shared?
Soon. I'm hoping really quickly. I just want to have one final chat internally, make sure we have a good process to getting the tools out. Do you have a preference on who they're sent to?
I agree with Lori, who just put in the email, CEO and CFO only.
Got it. Thank you, Lori. You predicted my question. I love it. Okay. We may have our contract monitors send them out. That way, get to the right people.
Recording of this will be, the link to the recording will also be sent.
Yep. If somebody can figure that part out for me. Yes, sir.
And not to slow down the getting the tool out. So the tool, if the tool has to go out before the recording is ready, that's
Yes.
good.
That sounds good. All right. All right. Any last thoughts? All right. Thank you. Have a great rest of your Monday and have a great week. Thank you all. Bye-bye.